In this learning objective, we'll learn how to compute the equivalent units of production using the weighted average method. But before we do this, let's review why it's important to calculate equivalent units of production. That story begins when we contrast job order costing and process order costing. Recall in a job order costing environment, the cost of individual jobs, that is our direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead, are accumulated on job cost sheets. These job cost sheets follow the jobs through the production process, from work in process to finished goods to cost of goods sold. And so it's easy to identify how much cost is associated with each job and whether that cost is in work in process, is in finished goods, or should be transferred to cost of goods sold. On the other hand, in a process costing environment, where we might make one or two homogeneous products, we make many units of those identical products. And it's difficult, if not impossible, to trace cost directly to individual units. Think about Apple Computer, how many iPods they make or iPhones they make. Think about a clothing manufacturer, how many t-shirts they crank out. Think about any product that's sold in a Walmart store. It would be difficult, if not impossible, and very time-consuming to trace cost individually to every single unit of production. So instead, in a process costing environment, we accumulate cost by departments, and then we need to take that total cost that's been accumulated in a department and allocate it to those units that have been transferred out to the next department or to finished goods, and to those units that remain in work in process. We do this by calculating average cost per unit. In its simplest form, we could calculate an average cost per unit by taking the total cost for a period. Again, that would be our beginning work in process cost plus direct material plus direct labor and manufacturing overhead, and divide it by the number of units that we have produced in a particular period. The complication comes in when we examine the number of units that we've produced. In a process costing environment, at the end of every period of time, we're likely to have a number of partially completed units on hand. This means that rather than calculating average cost per unit by taking our total cost and dividing it by total units, we need to calculate a cost per equivalent unit by dividing our total cost for the period by equivalent units of production for the period. Let's go ahead now and take a look at what we mean by equivalent units of production. Again, equivalent units need to be calculated because a department usually has some partially completed units in its beginning and its ending inventory. And partially completed units aren't the same thing as fully completed units, which is what we have when we transfer units to the next department or to finished goods. Equivalent units are the product of the number of partially completed units and the percentage of completion for those units. The basic idea is that two half-completed units are equivalent to one fully completed units. So, for example, if we had 10,000 units in ending work in process, and we estimated that they were 70% complete, this would be equivalent to having 7,000 fully completed or equivalent units. Let's take a quick concept check. For the current period, Jones started 15,000 units and completed 10,000 units, leaving 5,000 units in work in process that are 30% complete. How many equivalent units of production did Jones have for the period? First, recall that any units that were transferred out, that would be the 10,000 units, have to be 100% complete. Then consider, of those remaining 5,000 units, what's the stage of completion and what would be the equivalent units of production? We can see that we would have 11,500 equivalent units of production. The 10,000 fully completed units that we transferred out, plus 5,000 times the 30% for another 1,500 equivalent units in ending work in process. Our equivalent units can be calculated one of two ways. One, using a FIFO method, first in, first out, which we're not going to concern ourselves with in this particular learning objective, and also the weighted average method, which is what we're going to be discussing further right now. When we use the weighted average method, we make no distinction between work done in the prior period and work done in the current period. We blend the cost we blend together the units and the cost from both the prior and the current period. That is, we assume that any units that we transfer to the next department, those are units that we would have completed during the period, and then we take into account the stage of completion of our ending work in process. So in problems, if you're given information regarding the stage of completion for beginning work in process, that's not important to us when we're using our weighted average method. Finally, because direct labor is often a small component of product cost today, particularly in automated systems, which we're using typically in our process costing environment, rather than looking at equivalent units with respect to direct labor, direct materials, and manufacturing overhead, we will combine the direct labor cost with manufacturing overhead and consider just two types of cost, direct material and then conversion costs. Let's look at an example for the Smith Company for its assembly department for the month of June. Remember, the percentage of completion for beginning work in process is unimportant when we're using the weighted average method. So in computing our equivalent units of production, we only need to consider the units that were transferred out and those that were left in ending work in process. The 5,400 units that were transferred out need to have been fully completed with respect to both direct materials and conversion cost, or they wouldn't be transferred out of the assembly department. We were told that the work in process inventory on June 30th was 900 units. With respect to direct materials, these units were 60% complete. So we'll have 60% times 900, we'll have 540 equivalent units. So our total equivalent units for direct materials is the 5,400 for the units transferred out and 540 in ending work in process, for a total of 5,940 units. For conversion cost, we'll take the same 900 units, but this time we'll multiply it by the 30% estimated level of completion, and we get 270 equivalent units. So our total equivalent units for conversion cost would be 5,670 units. This is the 5,400 that were transferred out, and the 270 equivalent units in ending work in process inventory.